there is a number. It is not carved into granite. It has no wall, no monument, no eternal flame burning beside it in any capital city on earth. Across the full transatlantic slave trade, roughly 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. About 2 million did not survive the crossing. They died in the holds of ships, in chains, in the dark, within sight of a coastline they would never reach. Their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean without ceremony, without record, without names. Only a fraction of those 12.5 million were brought directly to what became the United States. But the system built here would shape this country more deeply than almost any other institution in its history. The nation those survivors helped build became one of the wealthiest in human history. This is the story of how that happened. Not as a verdict on any living person, not as a political argument dressed in the language of history, but as an honest accounting of decisions made by real people, inside a system that real people deliberately constructed, with consequences so deep and so structural that no one alive in America today has fully escaped their reach. On any side of any argument. The story of American slavery is not a story about the distant past. It is a story about how the present was built. And it begins not in Virginia in 1619, but on a different continent entirely, in a world far older and far more complex than the simple version most of us were taught. This is where it actually starts. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ships. Her name has not survived. That is the first thing to understand. The historical record of the transatlantic slave trade begins, for most of the people inside it, with an erasure. Names gone, languages gone, the specific village, the specific family, the specific life that existed before the ships, reduced in the records that do survive to an entry in a ledger, a number, a transaction. So we begin with what we can reconstruct. Sometime in the early 1600s, somewhere along the west coast of Africa, a woman was taken. We do not know if she was captured in a raid between neighboring kingdoms, sold by a local ruler to a coastal trader, or simply seized from her home by strangers who appeared without warning. We know she ended up on a ship. We know the ship crossed an ocean. We know she was one of millions. Before we follow her across that ocean, we need to understand the world she was taken from, because that world was not what the mythology of American slavery requires it to have been. Before the first ship crossed the Atlantic carrying African captives toward the Americas, slavery already existed on nearly every continent on Earth. That fact makes many people uncomfortable, because it can sound like an excuse. It is not an excuse. Understanding what slavery looked like before the transatlantic trade is not a way of diminishing what came after. It is the only way to understand what made the American system so different, so total, and so uniquely destructive that its consequences are still being measured today. Slavery, in some form, appears in the historical record of ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Ottoman Empire, the Arab world, China, India, and among various indigenous peoples of the Americas. The institution of one human being claiming ownership over another is, by the grim accounting of history, one of the oldest and most widespread human practices ever recorded. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a documented one. What varied enormously across these systems was the nature of the bondage itself. In ancient Rome, a slave could in some circumstances earn freedom, own property, and, in documented cases, rise to positions of significant influence. In the Arab slave trade, which predated the transatlantic trade by several centuries and continued long after it, the status of enslaved people varied widely depending on their role, their origin, and the household they served. In many pre-colonial African societies, slavery existed as an institution. But the children of enslaved people were not automatically enslaved themselves. The condition, in many of these systems, was not necessarily permanent, not necessarily inherited, and not necessarily tied to race. This distinction matters enormously, because what the Atlantic world built was something different in kind, not just in scale. Few previous systems had combined these elements at a scale and rigidity that was historically distinctive. The transatlantic slave trade made bondage racial, meaning your status was determined by the color of your skin. It made bondage hereditary, meaning your children and your children's children were born into the same condition regardless of anything they did or did not do. And it made bondage permanent, with no recognized legal path to freedom except through the will of the person who claimed to own you. Historians call this chattel slavery. The word chattel comes from the same root as cattle. It means movable property. Under chattel slavery, an enslaved human being was legally classified not as a person, but as a thing that could be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, rented out, and destroyed at the discretion of its owner. The combination of racial basis, hereditary transmission, and absolute legal reduction to property status, applied at the scale and with the rigidity that the Atlantic system produced, created something the world had not seen before in quite the same form. Now, to understand how the transatlantic trade became possible, we need to look honestly at West and Central Africa in the centuries before European contact. The Africa that Portuguese sailors first encountered along the western coast in the 1400s was not a continent of primitive villages waiting to be exploited. It was a continent of sophisticated kingdoms, long-distance trade networks, complex political systems, and deep cultural traditions that stretched back centuries. The Kingdom of Mali, which reached its peak in the 14th century, controlled trans-Saharan trade routes carrying gold and salt across thousands of miles. Its ruler, Musa I, known in the West as Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that reportedly carried so much gold it caused measurable disruption to commodity prices across Cairo and the Mediterranean region. The Kingdom of Congo, when Portuguese explorers arrived in the 1480s, was a centralized state with a sophisticated administrative structure, a system of currency, and a population estimated in the millions. The Yoruba city-states of what is now Nigeria maintained urban centers, artistic traditions, and trade networks of extraordinary complexity. These were not societies without internal conflict, and they were not societies without slavery. This is a point that honest history cannot avoid, and that honest history must also refuse to misuse. Slavery existed in West and Central Africa before Europeans arrived. African kingdoms raided neighboring peoples, took captives in warfare, and traded those captives across the Sahara to Arab merchants who had been purchasing enslaved Africans for centuries. When Portuguese traders arrived on the coast in the 1400s and began offering European goods in exchange for enslaved people, they were inserting themselves into a system of human trade that already existed. What they changed was the scale, the direction, and ultimately the nature of that trade beyond anything anyone had anticipated. African rulers and merchants who participated in this trade made choices that their descendants have grappled with ever since. The kingdom of Dahomey in what is now Benin became one of the most active participants in selling captives to European traders, building much of its political power and material wealth on the proceeds. The Ashanti Confederacy in what is now Ghana did the same. These were not naive or powerless actors. They were sophisticated political entities making calculated decisions in a system that rewarded participation. But here is what those rulers could not fully see from where they stood. The captives they sold were entering a system that would strip away not just their freedom, but their names, their languages, their family connections, their religious practices, and their legal existence as human beings. The African systems of slavery, with all their cruelty, had not produced anything like this. What awaited the people loaded onto European ships was something qualitatively different. The mechanics of how African captives were obtained varied considerably across the 3.5 centuries of the trade. Some were prisoners of war captured in conflicts between African kingdoms. Some were kidnapped in raids specifically organized for the purpose of supplying the coastal trade. Some were convicted of crimes in African legal systems and sentenced to enslavement. Some were simply taken by violence from their homes with no pretext at all. What they all shared was the experience of the coast. European traders rarely ventured far into the interior of Africa. Instead, they built fortified trading posts along the coastline, places like Elmina Castle in what is now Ghana, constructed by the Portuguese in 1482 and later seized by the Dutch. These castles served as holding facilities where captives brought from the interior were confined, sometimes for weeks or months, before being loaded onto ships. The conditions in these holding dungeons were often lethal. Thousands died before they ever saw the ocean they were about to cross. The woman whose name we do not know passed through somewhere like this. She was one of millions who did. And on the other side of the ocean she was crossing. A colony called Virginia was making decisions about what to do with people like her. Those decisions would build a system unlike anything that had come before in quite the same combination. And understanding how they were made, step by deliberate step, requires going to Virginia in 1619 to a moment when the story could still have gone differently. Because here is what most people do not know about that year. The system that would eventually enslave millions did not arrive fully formed on the first ship. It was built deliberately, over decades, by people who made choices. And that is what we look at next. Chapter 2, 1619, the year that changed everything. In late August of 1619, a ship appeared in the waters near Point Comfort, Virginia. It was an English privateer vessel, and it carried something the English colonists at Jamestown had not seen before. The ship's log recorded the transaction in a single spare line. It noted that the vessel sold to the governor and the Cape merchant 20 and odd Negroes in exchange for food and supplies. 20 and odd. That is all the record says. No names, no ages, no places of origin, no record of what those 20 and odd people thought or felt or understood about what was happening to them. They appear in the historical record as a commercial transaction, which is precisely how the society receiving them had decided to categorize them. For generations, 1619 was taught as the year American slavery began. The truth is more complicated, and the complication matters enormously, because those first 20 and odd Africans did not arrive into a fully formed system of racial chattel slavery. They arrived into a legal and social landscape that had not yet decided what to do with them, and the decisions that followed, made over the next several decades, reveal something deeply important. The system that would eventually enslave millions of people was not inevitable. It was chosen. To understand that choice, you have to understand what Virginia actually looked like in 1619. The Jamestown colony was 11 years old and had nearly destroyed itself multiple times. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, and catastrophic mismanagement had killed the vast majority of colonists who had arrived since 1607. The colony survived primarily because of one crop, tobacco. John Rolfe had begun cultivating a strain of tobacco in 1612 that English consumers found irresistible. And by 1619, the colony had found its economic reason to exist. Tobacco required enormous amounts of labor. Labor was the colony's most desperate need. The primary solution at this point was indentured servitude. Poor English men and women signed away several years of their lives in exchange for passage to the New World, arriving under contracts that bound them to work for a master for a fixed period, typically 4 to 7 years, after which they were legally free. The system was brutal. Indentures were bought and sold. Masters extended terms for minor infractions. The mortality rate among new arrivals was catastrophic. But here is the critical point. When those first 20 and odd Africans arrived in 1619, the legal category of permanent racial slavery did not yet exist in Virginia law. There was no statute defining Africans as slaves. There was no inherited status. There was no legal framework reducing them to property. What happened to some of those first arrivals is remarkable and largely unknown. Several of them eventually obtained their freedom. One man, documented in colonial records as Anthony Johnson, went further. He acquired land. He built a farm. He had a family. Colonial court records from the period suggest he successfully claimed that an African man named John Casor owed him lifelong service. Though historians have read this case in different ways and debate what it reveals about the legal landscape of the time, a formerly bound African man in mid-17th century Virginia, navigating a legal system that had not yet closed its doors to him. This is not a story about an exceptional individual. It is a story about a system that had not yet been redesigned to make such navigation impossible. The redesign was coming, but it had not arrived yet. What accelerated it was a crisis that had nothing to do with Africa and everything to do with class. By the 1660s and 1670s, Virginia was accumulating a serious and dangerous social problem. Indentured servants who survived their terms of service were being freed into a colony with very little available land. The best land was already claimed by the large planters. Former servants were angry, landless, and armed. They resented the wealthy planter class with an intensity that colonial authorities found deeply alarming. In 1676, that resentment exploded. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy young English gentleman who organized an armed rebellion against the colonial government of Governor William Berkeley. What made the rebellion uniquely terrifying to the planter class was not its violence alone. It was its composition. Poor white men and enslaved and free black men fought together against their common oppressors. Bacon's army burned Jamestown to the ground. Governor Berkeley fled. Bacon died of disease before the rebellion could consolidate. But the Virginia planter class had seen something that changed everything. They had seen that the line between races was not, by itself, sufficient to prevent class solidarity from forming across it. The solution they constructed over the following decades was as deliberate as anything in American legislative history. They systematically elevated the legal status of poor white Virginians relative to African workers. They granted white servants better terms, earlier freedom, and greater legal protections. And simultaneously, they systematically degraded the legal status of African workers, removing the ambiguities that had allowed people like Anthony Johnson to navigate the system, and replacing them with a rigid framework of permanent, hereditary, racial bondage. Bacon's rebellion did not cause American slavery, but it accelerated and crystallized the transformation of a fluid labor system into a racial caste system with a speed and deliberateness that the historical record makes unmistakable. By 1690, Virginia had moved decisively in a direction it would not reverse. The question was no longer whether racial chattel slavery would define the colony. The question was how completely it would be written into law. That writing is what we turn to next. And what was written in those rooms was not the work of passion or impulse. It was something far more deliberate, and in some ways, far more disturbing. Chapter 3. Building the Legal Machine. His name was Daniel. He was an enslaved man in colonial Virginia. And in 1703, 2 years before the Virginia General Assembly consolidated its slave legislation into a single comprehensive code, he did something that the emerging legal system was specifically designed to prevent. He learned to read. We do not know how he learned. We know he did because a court record survives documenting the punishment imposed on the white man who taught him. The punishment was a fine. For Daniel, the act of learning to read in a colony that was rapidly making such learning illegal was something closer to a declaration. Not a loud one, a quiet one, made in secret, in the space between what the law said and what a human being needed to become. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 did not invent racial slavery. It organized it. It took the accumulated decisions of the previous several decades and turned them into a coherent legal system with defined categories, defined punishments, and defined mechanisms of enforcement. What it reveals, when you read it carefully, is not the work of people acting on raw impulse or casual cruelty. It is the work of legislators who sat down, thought carefully about every dimension of the system they were building, and wrote it into law with the precision of architects designing a structure they intended to last. That precision is one of the most disturbing things about it. The code began with a definition. It defined who was a slave. The answer? Stripped to its essentials. Was anyone of African descent born to an enslaved mother? This single legal principle, known by the Latin phrase partus sequitur ventrum, meaning the offspring follows the condition of the mother, was the load-bearing wall of the entire system. Read that again slowly. The offspring follows the condition of the mother. It meant that slavery was self-reproducing. Every child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved, regardless of who the father was, regardless of any other circumstance. The enslaver's investment grew with every birth. The system expanded without requiring any additional importation of captives. Children became property the moment they entered the world. The implications of this principle extended in directions that the legislators understood perfectly well. If an enslaver fathered a child with an enslaved woman, that child was enslaved. The law created a direct financial incentive for sexual violence. It transformed the bodies of enslaved women into instruments of capital accumulation, and it did so not by accident, but by design. Because the alternative, recognizing the children of such unions as free, would have undermined the entire economic logic of the system. The code then defined what an enslaved person could and could not do. The list of prohibitions was comprehensive. Enslaved people could not own property. They could not enter into contracts. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not legally marry, because marriage was a contract, and they could not make contracts. They could not leave their enslavers' property without written permission. They could not gather in groups above a certain number. Even for religious purposes, they could not be taught to read. This is why Daniel mattered. This is why the men writing the code understood that literacy was not a minor convenience to be casually prohibited. It was a threat to the entire architecture. An enslaved person who could read, could forge a pass, could understand a legal document, could read the arguments being made about his own freedom by the people who denied it, could, as Hugh Old would warn his wife about Frederick Douglass a century and a half later, become unfit to be a slave. The punishment provisions were written with a specificity that reveals how thoroughly the legislators had thought through the mechanics of control. An enslaved person who struck a white person could be killed. An enslaved person who attempted to escape and was captured could be physically mutilated. The code created conditions where lethal violence against enslaved people rarely faced legal consequence, because the system was designed to protect those who administered it. But law requires enforcement. And here is where the Virginia Slave Code created something with a long and complicated legacy in American history. To enforce the past system, to capture escapees, to prevent the gatherings the code prohibited, and to suppress the uprisings that planters rightly feared. Virginia and other slave colonies developed organized systems of patrols. Groups of armed white men were authorized and in many cases required by law to ride through their counties at night, stop and question any black person without a written pass, search slave quarters, and disperse any gatherings they found. Historians debate how directly these patrols connect to later police institutions in the American South. And careful history must acknowledge that debate, rather than flatten it into a simple equation. What is not seriously disputed is that slave patrols represent one of the earliest examples in American history of organized, government-authorized, community-based enforcement of public order in the South, and that they shaped the development of policing in that region in ways that researchers continue to study and document. What the Virginia Code also accomplished was to make slavery a matter of race in a way that could not be escaped through any individual achievement. Earlier in the colonial period, some enslaved Africans had argued that their conversion to Christianity entitled them to freedom. The 1705 Code explicitly closed that door. Baptism, it stated, did not alter the condition of the person in terms of their bondage or freedom. This was not a minor theological clarification. It was a statement that the defining characteristic of enslavement was ancestry, and that no individual characteristic could override it. It transformed slavery from a condition that might be escaped into a caste that could not be. Virginia's code became the model. Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland, North Carolina, and eventually every state where slavery took root built their own legal systems on similar foundations. The legal mechanisms spread south and west as the plantation system expanded. But here is something that the standard narrative of American slavery often obscures. The slave system was not a regional peculiarity of the American South. It was a national economic system, and the North was part of it. The participation of northern colonies and later northern states in the slave economy was not identical to the participation of the plantation South, but it was extensive, documented, and significant to the system's functioning. The ships that carried enslaved people across the Atlantic were frequently built in New England shipyards, insured by New England merchants, and captained by New England sailors. The cotton that enslaved people in the South grew and harvested was processed in textile mills in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Large sectors of the financial and commercial life of northern cities were connected to the slave economy through credit, insurance, and commodity markets. Researchers examining the historical records of 18th and 19th century financial institutions have documented connections between predecessor companies and the financing of slave-based enterprises. These connections varied considerably in their nature and extent from institution to institution, and the historical record requires careful, source-by-source examination rather than broad generalization. What is not in serious dispute is that large sectors of the American economy were deeply connected to the slave system in ways that made the institution's continuation a matter of broad commercial interest, not merely a Southern one. The wealth generated by the slave economy did not stay in the South. It moved through the entire Atlantic economy, enriching merchants, manufacturers, and financiers who never owned an enslaved person. The slave system was not a Southern aberration from an otherwise free economy. It was woven into the commercial fabric of the entire nation. Daniel, the man who learned to read in 1703, was one person inside a machine that was becoming national in its reach. The machine was built law by law, provision by provision, by men who understood exactly what they were constructing. What that machine produced, in human lives and in dollars, is what we examine next. Because the laws are one thing, what happened inside them is something that statutes alone cannot capture. It begins on the water, in the middle of an ocean, in the dark. Chapter 4. The Economy of Human Flesh. There is a database. It is maintained by scholars at several universities and contains records of more than 35,000 voyages made by slave ships across the Atlantic Ocean between the early 1500s and the mid-1800s. It records the names of ships, the names of captains, the ports of departure, the ports of arrival, and wherever the records survived, the numbers of human beings loaded onto each vessel and the numbers who arrived alive at the other end. It is called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And when you spend time with its numbers, something happens to your understanding of what the word system actually means. This was not a series of isolated criminal acts. This was not the work of a handful of rogue merchants operating outside the boundaries of respectable society. This was an organized, financed, insured, legislated, and government-protected commercial enterprise that operated continuously for more than 3 centuries, involving thousands of ships, tens of thousands of crew members, hundreds of financial institutions, and the explicit legal sanction of every major European colonial power, including England, Portugal, Spain, France, and the Netherlands. To understand the economy of American slavery, you have to start with the crossing itself, because the Middle Passage, the voyage from the African coast to the Americas, was not simply a method of transportation. It was the first act of a system designed to strip human beings of everything that made them who they were. The ships used in the trade were modified to maximize the number of human beings that could be packed into a given space. Captives were chained together in pairs, wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle, and laid in rows in the lower decks, with so little vertical space that many could not sit upright. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database documents that ships carried anywhere from 100 to 500 or more captives, depending on the vessel's size. The space allocated to each person was, in some documented cases, less than what would be given to a coffin. The crossing took anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on winds, weather, and route. In that time, captives were held in conditions that made disease nearly inevitable. Dysentery, smallpox, and respiratory infections spread through the packed holds with lethal efficiency. The mortality figures recorded in the database are stark. Across the full period of the trade, roughly 15% of captives died during the crossing. In the earlier centuries of the trade, before some modest improvements in conditions were made in response to abolitionist pressure, the rate was considerably higher. Applying that 15% average to the 12.5 million people loaded onto ships produces a figure of roughly 2 million people who died in the Atlantic Ocean. 2 million people in the water, without graves. The captains and merchants who ran this system were aware of the mortality rates. They factored them into their calculations. They purchased insurance policies that covered the loss of enslaved people during the crossing as cargo loss, because that is what the law said they were. There are documented legal cases from the 18th century in which ship captains threw living enslaved people overboard to claim insurance money, because a cargo lost at sea was insured, while a cargo that arrived sick and unsaleable was not. The most extensively documented of these cases, involving the British slave ship Zong in 1781, went to court not as a murder case, but as an insurance dispute. When the survivors of the crossing arrived in the Americas, they entered a market, the slave markets of Charleston, New Orleans, Richmond, and other major trading cities were organized commercial spaces where enslaved human beings were displayed, inspected, priced, and sold with the same transactional efficiency applied to any other commodity. Buyers examined teeth to estimate age, felt muscles to assess strength. Prices varied based on age, sex, perceived health, and the specific labor needs of the buyer. Families who had survived the crossing together were separated at these markets without legal recourse or acknowledged sentiment. A husband could be sold to a buyer from Georgia while his wife went to Mississippi and their children went to separate buyers entirely. The law did not recognize their family relationship as creating any obligation on the seller or buyer. They were property being divided, not a family being destroyed. Now, to understand why this system was so deeply embedded in American economic life, you have to understand what it produced. The answer, for most of American slavery's history, is cotton. Before 1793, cotton was a relatively minor crop in the American South. The problem was processing. The short staple cotton that grew well across the inland South was extraordinarily labor-intensive to clean, because its seeds were tightly embedded in the fiber and had to be picked out by hand. A skilled worker could clean roughly 1 pound of cotton per day. It was not economically competitive at that rate. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. The machine could clean roughly 50 times as much cotton per day as a person working by hand. The effect on the economics of cotton cultivation was immediate and transformative. Here's the part that is rarely taught clearly. The cotton gin did not reduce the demand for enslaved labor. It dramatically increased it, because if you could process 50 times as much cotton per day, the limiting factor in your production was no longer the cleaning. It was the growing and the harvesting. And growing and harvesting cotton was still entirely done by hand, by human beings working under conditions of compelled labor enforced by violence. In 1790, there were approximately 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. That expansion tracks almost exactly with the expansion of cotton cultivation across the Deep South. Cotton became the dominant American export. By 1860, historians and economists estimate that cotton represented roughly half to 60% of all American exports by value. Depending on the year and methodology used, large sectors of the American economy were substantially organized around it. The textile mills of Massachusetts and Rhode Island processed Southern cotton. The banks of New York financed Southern plantations. Insurance companies insured enslaved people as property, because that is what the law defined them as being. Economic historians continue to debate the precise scale of slavery's contribution to American national income. And those debates involve genuine methodological disagreements that honest accounts should acknowledge. What is not seriously disputed across that scholarly conversation is that large sectors of the slave economy were deeply integrated into the national economy in ways that made the system's continuation a matter of broad commercial interest. North and South alike? Here is a dimension of the slave economy that is almost entirely absent from popular accounts. After Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, the domestic slave trade became one of the most economically significant industries in the United States. Planters in the upper South states of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, whose soils were becoming exhausted from decades of tobacco cultivation, found that their most valuable asset was not their land. It was their enslaved people, who could be sold to buyers in the expanding cotton states of the Deep South. Historical research drawing on slave sale records, plantation account books, and census data documents that in the decades between 1808 and 1860, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, with some scholarly estimates ranging considerably higher, were sold from the Upper South to the Deep South in what historians call the domestic slave trade. Families were separated. Communities were destroyed. People who had lived their entire lives in Virginia found themselves transported to Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana, among people they did not know, with no legal mechanism to ever reconnect with the families left behind. The financial infrastructure supporting all of this extended far beyond the South. Researchers examining the historical records of banking and financial institutions have documented connections between various predecessor companies and the financing of slave-based enterprises in the 18th and 19th centuries. These connections varied considerably in their nature and extent, and the precise relationship between historical predecessor entities and present-day institutions requires careful source-by-source examination. What is documented is that the credit markets, insurance markets, and commodity markets of the 19th century were substantially connected to the slave economy in ways that implicated commercial institutions far from the plantation fields. The economy of human flesh was not a Southern economy. It was an American economy. The people who built that economy, field by field and season by season, were the 4 million human beings held in bondage by 1860. What it actually felt like to be inside that system, to be the person behind the number in the ledger, is what we turn to now. Chapter 5. Life Inside the System. Start with a sound. Before dawn, before the sun has cleared the tree line. A bell, or a horn, or simply a voice moving through the dark. And the day begins. Not because you chose it, not because you are ready, Because the system that owns you has calculated exactly how many hours of your body it needs today. And it has decided the calculation begins now. This was the daily reality for nearly 4 million people in the American South in 1860. Not an abstraction, not a statistic, a bell before dawn, every morning, for a lifetime. American chattel slavery was not simply a labor arrangement. It was a total institution, meaning it was designed to control not just the labor of enslaved people, but their movement, their relationships, their language, their religion, their knowledge, their family structures, and their understanding of themselves. The goal, as articulated by the planters and legislators who built and maintained the system, was the production of what they called a docile workforce. What they meant was a human being so thoroughly stripped of agency, identity, and hope that resistance became unthinkable. They did not fully succeed. And the ways in which they failed tell you as much about the people inside the system as the system itself does. The physical conditions of enslaved life varied considerably depending on geography, crop, the size of the operation, and the individual characteristics of the enslaver. This variation is real and should be acknowledged. What should not be confused with that variation is any suggestion that conditions were, on balance, tolerably. The historical record, assembled from plantation records, court documents, newspaper accounts, and most critically, the testimonies of formerly enslaved people recorded in the thousands by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, is unambiguous on the essentials. Enslaved people worked under a system of compelled labor enforced by the threat and regular application of violence. The whip was not an occasional tool of last resort. It was a standard management instrument, used regularly and often publicly. Public punishment was designed to be witnessed, to communicate to every enslaved person watching what the consequences of non-compliance looked like. This was understood and stated explicitly by those who administered the system. Field labor in cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco cultivation was physically brutal. Cotton picking required workers to move continuously through rows of plants under the southern sun, dragging a sack that grew heavier through the day, meeting daily quotas calibrated to the maximum a person could physically produce. Plantation record books from this period document cases where overseers recorded daily output for each worker. Those who fell below their quota faced punishment, and those who exceeded it often found their quota raised. Sugar cultivation in Louisiana was considered by contemporaries to be among the most brutal forms of agricultural labor in the Americas. The harvest season required essentially continuous labor day and night for weeks. Enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations died at rates that required constant replenishment from the domestic slave trade. The life expectancy on a Louisiana sugar plantation was, by historical estimates drawing on plantation mortality records, significantly shorter than in other agricultural regions. Now, here is where the standard account of enslaved life often stops. And here is where honest history must go further. Because the people inside this system were not simply victims of it. They were human beings with full interior lives, with agency, with creativity, with love and anger and humor and spiritual depth, who built lives and cultures and communities inside a machine specifically designed to prevent them from doing so. Think about what that means. Every family formed, every child named, every song composed, every prayer offered in secret was an act of resistance against a system that said these things should not exist. The bell rang before dawn to claim the body. The body showed up, but something else, something the system could monitor but never fully own, persisted. The family was the center of enslaved social life, and it was the institution, the system, most systematically attacked. Legally, enslaved people could not marry, because marriage was a contract and they could not make contracts. But enslaved people formed families anyway, maintained them with fierce devotion, understood their family bonds as real and binding, regardless of what the law said. Accounts from formerly enslaved people are filled with descriptions of marriages conducted by community ceremony, of parents who walked miles on their only free time to visit children sold to neighboring plantations, of families that maintained contact across distances and years despite every obstacle the system placed before them. The forced separation of families by sale was one of the most consistently documented sources of grief and trauma in enslaved life. When researchers have examined slave sale records, they find evidence of family separations on a scale that the surviving records can only partially capture. Husbands sold away from wives, children sold away from parents, siblings divided among multiple buyers at a single auction. When freedom came, formerly enslaved people placed advertisements in newspapers across the South, searching for family members from whom they had been separated, sometimes by decades. The historian Heather Andrea Williams has documented thousands of these advertisements, and they constitute one of the most moving bodies of evidence in American historical scholarship. People searching for mothers they had not seen in 30 years. Brothers sold away in childhood. Daughters taken to places whose names had been forgotten. They never stopped looking. Enslaved people responded to this threat with a determination to maintain family connections that the record documents extensively. They named children after separated relatives to preserve memory. They maintained knowledge of family members sold away through networks of communication that moved across plantation boundaries despite the restrictions of the pass system. Religion was another domain where enslaved people built something the system could not entirely control. The Christianity that enslavers promoted was, by design, a version of the faith that emphasized obedience and patience. There are documented instances of planters and ministers preaching specifically to enslaved congregations the virtues of submission. The theological case for slavery was elaborated in considerable detail by Southern ministers and intellectuals in the antebellum period, and it was deployed as a tool of social control with conscious intent. Enslaved people took this religion and made something different from it. In the hidden religious gatherings that took place away from white supervision, in what formerly enslaved people called the hush harbor, a different theology emerged, one that centered liberation. That found in the story of Moses and the Israelites a direct parallel to their own condition. That understood the God of the Bible as a God who was on the side of the enslaved rather than the enslaver. The spirituals that emerged from this tradition were not simply songs. They were encoded communications, theological arguments, and expressions of a faith transformed by the specific experience of people in bondage. Go down, Moses. Swing low, sweet chariot. These were heard by enslavers as evidence of contentment. They were understood by those who sang them as something else entirely. The range of resistance that enslaved people practiced was as varied as the conditions they faced. Working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, misunderstanding instructions, stealing food, sabotaging equipment. These acts were small in scale but constant in practice, representing a continuous negotiation of the terms of exploitation, even within a system that denied any formal power to negotiate. At the other end of the spectrum was open rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher in Southampton County, Virginia, who, in August of 1831, led the most significant slave rebellion in American history. Turner and his followers killed approximately 60 white Virginians before the rebellion was suppressed. Turner was captured, tried, and executed. The rebellion he led produced a response that illustrates one of the most important dynamics of the slave system. White Southerners did not respond by questioning whether a system producing such violent resistance might be fundamentally unsustainable. They responded by making the system more restrictive, more violent, and more total. The Virginia legislature debated gradual emancipation in the immediate aftermath and chose instead to intensify control. The doors that had remained slightly open were closed. The screws were tightened, and the people inside the system absorbed the new weight of that tightening and kept going. The bell still rang before dawn the next morning, and the morning after that. It rang for people who had never known Nat Turner, and for people who had fought beside him. It rang through the tightened restrictions and the intensified patrols and the new laws designed to make rebellion unthinkable. It rang because the system that required it had decided that the response to resistance was not reconsideration, but reinforcement, and it would keep ringing for another 30 years. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland around 1818. He taught himself to read against the explicit prohibition of his enslaver, understanding even as a child that literacy was power and that the system prohibited it for exactly that reason. He escaped to the North in 1838 and became the most important black intellectual and orator in 19th century America. In his most famous speech, delivered on the 4th of July in 1852, Douglass addressed a white audience in Rochester, New York, and said something that no comfortable patriotism could absorb without difficulty. He told them that the 4th of July was their holiday, not his, that the celebration of American freedom was, to the enslaved person, a revelation of the hypocrisy and cruelty of a nation that could celebrate liberty while practicing bondage on a massive scale. He was not making a simple argument. He was making a structural one. The freedom celebrated on the 4th of July was not incidentally compatible with slavery. It was specifically and deliberately constructed to coexist with it. And that coexistence was not an accident. It was a choice. Harriet Jacobs was an enslaved woman in North Carolina who spent nearly 7 years hiding in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house, unable to stand upright, watching her children grow up through a small hole in the wall, in order to avoid the sexual predation of her enslaver and eventually escape to the North. Her account, published in 1861 under the title Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was for years dismissed by some historians as too extreme to be credible. Later research confirmed its essential accuracy and recognized it as one of the most important first-person accounts of enslaved life ever written. What Jacobs documented was a dimension of the slave system that public discourse sometimes still finds difficult to address directly. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not incidental to the slave system. It was structural. Enslaved women had no legal recourse against sexual violence. The law explicitly refused to recognize assault of an enslaved woman as a crime. The children born of such violence were enslaved from birth, adding to the enslaver's property under the legal principle we examined in an earlier chapter. This was documented. It was a feature of the system, not a deviation from it. The lives of enslaved people were not reducible to victimhood. That point cannot be made strongly enough. The human beings inside this system loved, created, argued, laughed, grieved, worshipped, and built communities with the full complexity of human beings in any other circumstances. They produced a musical tradition that would eventually give the world blues, jazz, and gospel. They maintained agricultural knowledge, culinary traditions, and craft skills that shaped American material culture in ways still present today. But their lives were also shaped in every dimension by a system of violence and control so comprehensive that no individual ingenuity or community strength could fully escape it. The trauma of family separation, of sexual violence, of physical punishment, of the constant knowledge that you and everyone you loved could be sold at any moment to a stranger in another state, was not incidental to enslaved life. It was the defining context of it. The bell rang before dawn. It rang for generations. And the country that built the system that required that bell was also, in the very same years, writing documents about freedom and equality, how those two things existed together, and why the people who wrote those documents chose to let them coexist, is the question we turn to next. Chapter 6. The Founders' Bargain. In the summer of 1776, a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer sat in a rented room in Philadelphia and wrote one of the most consequential sentences in the history of human political thought. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson wrote those words. He believed them, or believed some version of them, with the sincerity that his letters and private writings confirm. He was also, at the moment he wrote them, the legal owner of more than 100 enslaved human beings. Monticello's own historical research documents that Jefferson held more than 600 people in bondage over the course of his lifetime, making him one of the largest enslavers in Virginia. The contradiction is so stark that people have been arguing about what it means for 2.5 centuries. Was Jefferson a hypocrite? Was he a product of his time who cannot be judged by modern standards? Was the Declaration of Independence a promissory note that subsequent generations were obligated to redeem? Was it a philosophical framework that its author never seriously intended to apply universally? The honest answer is that it was all of these things simultaneously. And honest examination of the founders' relationship to slavery requires holding that complexity rather than resolving it prematurely into any simpler story. Jefferson's personal relationship to slavery is the place to begin, because it is the most documented. Jefferson wrote extensively about the moral evil of slavery, calling it in one letter a moral and political depravity, and describing the relationship between enslaver and enslaved as one that degraded the morals of the enslaver as surely as it brutalized the enslaved. He understood, with the precision of an intelligent man who had thought carefully about the problem, that slavery was incompatible with the principles of republican government he was helping to establish. He did not free his enslaved people during his lifetime. With the exception of a small number of individuals to whom he had specific personal obligations, he did not use his considerable political influence to push for abolition at the national level. He did not, despite his private writings about the institution's evil, take any significant public action to bring about its end. Why? The answer Jefferson himself gave, most explicitly in a letter written in 1820, when the Missouri crisis was forcing the slavery question back into national politics, was this. He described the situation as holding a wolf by the ear. You cannot hold on, he wrote, and you cannot safely let go. He understood that slavery was destroying the republic he had helped to found. He also told himself that the immediate consequences of emancipation were too dangerous and too uncertain to risk. What Jefferson did not write in that letter, but what the historical record makes visible, was the other calculation. Monticello, his library, his scientific instruments, his architectural experiments, his entire way of life, rested on the labor of enslaved people. The wolf he was holding by the ear was also the source of everything he had. He was not unique in this. He was representative. George Washington owned more than 300 enslaved people at the time of his death and made arrangements in his will to free them, only after his wife Martha also died. An arrangement that served to protect the estate's economic functioning during Martha's lifetime. In his private correspondence, Washington expressed discomfort with slavery and hoped it would eventually end. In his public life, he did almost nothing to bring that end closer. James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, owned enslaved people throughout his life and never freed them. He understood the slavery question as a political problem requiring management rather than a moral emergency requiring action. His management of it at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 produced specific compromises that would shape American politics for the next 70 years. The Constitutional Convention is where the founders' bargain was struck in its most explicit and documented form. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 faced a problem they could not ignore and could not fully solve. The Southern states, whose economies were substantially organized around enslaved labor, would not join a union that threatened that system. The Northern states needed the Southern states in the Union for the new nation to be viable. Something had to give. What they produced was a constitution that accommodated slavery without naming it directly, using careful circumlocutions that acknowledged the political reality while avoiding the moral vocabulary that would have made the accommodation too explicit to defend. The word slave does not appear in the original Constitution. The institution it protected is present throughout. The 3/5 compromise determined how enslaved people would be counted for the purpose of apportioning representatives in Congress and calculating each state's share of direct federal taxes. The answer was 3/5. An enslaved person counted as 3/5 of a free person for these purposes. The political implications were significant, and the delegates understood them. The 3/5 compromise gave the slaveholding Southern states substantially more representation in Congress than their free population alone would have justified. It gave them more electoral votes in presidential elections. It meant that the political power of the slaveholding class was amplified by the very people it enslaved, who had no voice in the government whose composition their existence shaped. This was not an oversight. The delegates debated it explicitly and understood its implications. The Constitution also contained a provision protecting the international slave trade from federal interference for 20 years, until 1808. This was a direct concession to the Deep South states of South Carolina and Georgia, whose planters wanted continued access to imported captives and threatened to leave the convention if the trade was threatened. Delegates from northern states who found the trade morally repugnant agreed to protect it for 2 decades in exchange for Southern participation in the Union. The Fugitive Slave Clause required that enslaved people who escaped to free states be returned to their enslavers. This provision made the entire nation legally complicit in the maintenance of slavery. A person who escaped bondage in Virginia and reached Pennsylvania was not free under the Constitution. Pennsylvania was obligated to participate in returning them. These were not accidental features of the document. They were the price of union, and the men who agreed to that price knew exactly what they were buying and what they were selling. Alexander Hamilton presents a more complicated case that illustrates how even the founders most associated with opposition to slavery navigated the system's demands. Hamilton was born in the Caribbean, witnessed the slave trade at close range as a child, and wrote against slavery on multiple occasions. He was a founder of the New York Manumission Society, which worked toward gradual abolition in New York. He was, by the standards of his time and class, more troubled by slavery than most of his contemporaries. He also married into one of New York's most prominent slaveholding families. His political coalition included slaveholders whose support he needed. His financial program as the first Secretary of the Treasury was substantially built on revenues generated by large sectors of the slave economy. His opposition to slavery never translated into political action that would have cost him anything significant. Hamilton's complexity is not a reason to diminish him. It is a reason to understand the structural constraints within which even those founders who found slavery most troubling were operating. The political system they were building required the support of slaveholders. The economy they were building was connected to slave-produced wealth in ways that made principled opposition extraordinarily costly at a personal level. Some of them paid the cost of principle more fully. John Adams owned no enslaved people and was consistent in his private opposition throughout his life. Though he, too, avoided making abolition a political priority in ways that might have fractured the Union. His wife, Abigail Adams, was more direct, writing to him during the debates over independence that she found it remarkable that men who fought for liberty could deny it so completely to others. She was not wrong, and the men she was describing knew she was not wrong. Here is the thing that makes the founders' bargain genuinely tragic rather than simply hypocritical. Several of the most important founders understood with clarity, stated in private writings that historians have examined extensively, that the choice they were making would not resolve the slavery question. It would only defer it. Jefferson wrote in 1820 that the Missouri question filled him with terror. He called it the knell of the Union. He knew that the thing he and his generation had chosen not to confront had not gone away. It had grown. Madison, in his notes on the Constitutional Convention published after his death, recorded the explicit acknowledgement by multiple delegates that the compromises being made on slavery were compromises with a problem that could not be permanently managed. They knew. They built the containment anyway, and they passed the problem to their successors with full knowledge that the containment would eventually fail. The people who bore the cost of that deferral were the millions of human beings held in bondage, while the political class managed the contradictions of a slaveholding republic. They paid it in the only currency the system recognized: their labor, their families, their bodies, their lives. The bell rang before dawn. It rang while Jefferson wrote about liberty. It rang while Madison drafted the Constitution. It rang while the delegates in Philadelphia agreed to protect the trade that made it necessary. The people who first said that this bargain was unacceptable, who refused to accept the political logic of deferral and demanded an immediate reckoning with the contradiction at the heart of American life, came not from the halls of Congress or the plantation houses of Virginia. They came from Quaker meeting houses and abolitionist printing presses and the lived experience of people who had survived the system the founders had chosen to preserve. What they built, slowly, at enormous personal cost, and not without fierce disagreement among themselves, changed the country. Eventually. Chapter 7. The Abolition Movement. The word eventually carries a weight that is easy to miss. Eventually means decades of people publishing newspapers that got their offices burned down. It means women who were told to sit down and let the men argue the moral case, who stood up anyway. It means a man who escaped slavery and then spent 30 years being introduced at public events as a curiosity, as proof, as evidence, when what he was the most intellectually formidable person in the room, eventually means the movement we turn to now. On the first day of January, in 1831, a 25-year-old white printer in Boston published the first issue of a newspaper called The Liberator. The opening statement was addressed to anyone who thought the slavery question could continue to be managed through patience, compromise, and gradual accommodation. William Lloyd Garrison wrote that he would be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. He wrote that he would not equivocate. He would not excuse. He would not retreat a single inch. And he would be heard. He meant it. For 35 years. Through threats, mob violence, and the sustained opposition of people who agreed with his goals but found his methods politically counterproductive. Garrison published The Liberator without interruption. He burned a copy of the Constitution publicly, calling it a covenant with death. Because it protected slavery, he was, by almost any measure, the most polarizing figure in American public life in the decades before the Civil War. He was also not the movement's most important voice. That distinction belongs to a man who had experienced slavery from the inside. But to understand where Frederick Douglass arrived, you have to understand where the abolition movement came from. The earliest organized opposition to American slavery came from the Society of Friends, the Quakers, whose theological convictions led them to question the compatibility of slaveholding with Christian principles earlier and more consistently than almost any other religious group in the colonial period. Quaker meetings in Pennsylvania were debating the morality of slavery as early as the 1680s. John Woolman, a New Jersey Quaker who traveled through the southern colonies in the 1750s and 60s, visiting Quaker slaveholders and quietly urging them to reconsider their practice, represents one of the earliest examples of sustained, organized moral pressure against the institution. The Revolutionary period produced a brief moment of genuine possibility. The language of natural rights and human equality that justified American independence from Britain was explicitly recognized by some founders and by some members of the public as applying to enslaved people with equal or greater force than it applied to colonists chafing under British taxation. Several northern states abolished slavery in the years immediately following independence, either through legislative action or through court decisions that applied natural rights principles to enslaved people seeking freedom. By 1804, every state north of Maryland had either abolished slavery or passed gradual emancipation laws. This was a genuine achievement. It was also incomplete in ways that would become increasingly apparent. The northern states that abolished slavery did not thereby separate themselves from the slave economy. They remained financially and commercially connected to it in the ways we examined in earlier chapters. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816 and supported by some prominent figures, proposed what it called a solution. It would purchase the freedom of enslaved people and transport them to a colony in Africa, which became Liberia. The Society's membership included slaveholders who supported colonization not out of opposition to slavery, but out of opposition to the presence of free black people in American society. Free black Americans largely opposed it with a clarity and forcefulness that the white-led abolitionist movement sometimes struggled to match. David Walker, a free black man in Boston, published his appeal in 1829, a document that argued with controlled fury that black Americans were Americans, that Africa was not their home, that they would not leave the country their ancestors had built with their labor. and that if American slavery was not ended by peaceful means, it would be ended by violence. Walker's appeal circulated through the South through networks of free black sailors and shipworkers, terrifying slaveholders and state legislatures who responded by passing laws against the circulation of anti-slavery literature. Walker died in 1830, possibly of tuberculosis, possibly by other means. His appeal did not die with him. Garrison's launch of The Liberator in 1831 represents the beginning of what historians call the immediate abolitionist movement, distinguished from earlier approaches by its demand for immediate, unconditional emancipation rather than gradual accommodation. Garrison's position was morally uncompromising in a way that previous abolitionist organizations had not been. He did not ask slaveholders to consider the economics of transition. He told them they were sinners who needed to repent. This uncompromising moral stance had real strategic costs. It was extraordinarily effective at generating moral clarity and public attention. It was less effective at generating the political coalitions that actual legislative change required. And it created within the movement a set of tensions that would eventually produce one of the most consequential strategic disagreements in the history of American political organizing. Frederick Douglass arrived at the center of those tensions from a direction no white abolitionist could approach. Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland around 1818. His mother was an enslaved woman named Harriet Bailey. His father was almost certainly a white man, possibly his enslaver, though Douglass was deliberately kept ignorant of the details. He was separated from his mother as an infant, a practice that was common and intentional, designed to prevent the formation of family bonds that might complicate the enslaver's control. Sent as a young boy to work in the Baltimore household of a relative of his enslaver, something happened that he later identified as the turning point of his life. His new mistress, a woman named Sophia Auld, who had not previously owned enslaved people, began teaching the young Douglass his letters. When her husband discovered this, he forbade it with an explanation that Douglass heard and never forgot. Hugh Auld told his wife that literacy would make the boy unfit to be a slave. It would make him discontent and ungovernable. Douglass later wrote that this was the first plainly stated philosophical argument against his freedom that he had ever encountered, and that hearing it told him exactly what he needed to do. If literacy was the thing the system most feared, then literacy was the thing he most needed. He spent the following years teaching himself to read and write using every means available to him, trading food to white children in exchange for reading lessons, copying letters from ship timbers in the Baltimore shipyard where he eventually worked. He escaped to the North in 1838, using a disguise and borrowed documents. Within 3 years, he had become the most compelling public voice against American slavery that the country had ever heard. His autobiography, published in 1845, was a direct refutation of the pro-slavery argument that enslaved people were content with their condition or incapable of the intellectual and moral life that freedom required. Douglass's relationship with Garrison was initially close and then became one of the most instructive strategic disagreements in the history of American reform. Garrison believed the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and that moral suasion, the direct appeal to the conscience of slaveholders and of the American public, was the proper instrument of abolition. He told Douglass early in their relationship that Douglass's role was to tell his story and leave the arguments to others. Douglass eventually concluded that this was wrong on both counts. By 1851, Douglass had broken with Garrison and announced his position that the Constitution, properly interpreted, was not a pro-slavery document, but an anti-slavery one, and that political engagement, voting, running candidates, and building coalitions within the existing system, was not a betrayal of abolitionist principles, but a necessary instrument of achieving them. The Garrison-Douglas split was not simply personal. It was a fundamental disagreement about strategy that maps onto debates within every major social reform movement in American history. Do you change a corrupt system by refusing to engage with it and maintaining the purity of your moral position? Or do you engage with the system as it is, accepting the compromises that engagement requires, in the belief that change from within is more achievable than transformation from without? Both positions had genuine arguments in their favor. Garrison's uncompromising moral clarity helped create the cultural and emotional conditions in which slavery became increasingly difficult to defend in polite Northern society. Douglas's political pragmatism helped create the conditions in which a political party explicitly opposed to the extension of slavery could win a presidential election in 1860. Neither approach alone would have been sufficient. Harriet Tubman represents a third approach, one that operated outside the realm of argument entirely. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Tubman escaped to Philadelphia in 1849. She had traveled for days through woods and swamps, moving at night, guided by the North Star and by a network of sympathetic strangers whose names she never publicly revealed. When she crossed into Pennsylvania and felt free soil under her feet for the first time, she later said she felt like she was in heaven. The trees and the grass and the air felt different. Then she did something that almost no one in her situation did. She went back. Not once, but approximately 13 times over the following decade, guiding at least several dozen enslaved people north to freedom, with some historical accounts suggesting the number was considerably higher, through the network of safe houses and sympathetic supporters known as the Underground Railroad. She carried a pistol and was direct about its purpose. Any person who became too frightened to continue and wanted to turn back would not be turning back. She could not allow someone who knew the network's routes and safe houses to return to a world where that information could be extracted by force. She never lost a passenger. The Underground Railroad was not a physical railway. It was a loosely organized network of hiding places, transportation arrangement, and sympathetic individuals, both black and white, who provided shelter, food, and guidance to people making the dangerous journey north. Its operations were necessarily clandestine, and its records deliberately incomplete, which means that historical estimates of the number of people it assisted vary considerably. What is documented in court records, newspaper accounts, and participant testimonies is that it functioned continuously for decades, and that the people who operated it risked serious legal consequences under the Fugitive Slave Act. During the Civil War, Tubman served the Union Army as a scout and intelligence gatherer, using the skills in covert movement and information gathering she had developed over a decade of clandestine operations. In June of 1863, she guided Union forces along the Combahee River in South Carolina in an operation that, according to military records and subsequent historical research, including biographies by Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton, liberated more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. It was one of the largest liberation operations of the entire war, and it was conducted on intelligence that Tubman had personally gathered. She received minimal compensation for this service. Her applications for recognition of her wartime contributions involved a decades-long process that was not fully resolved until the early 1900s, a delay that reflected how the military service of Black Americans, and particularly of Black women, was treated by the government they had served. She died in 1913 at approximately 90 years old, having spent her final years establishing a home for elderly African Americans in Auburn, New York. Her last words, recorded by those present, were that she was going to prepare a place for them. Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in New York around 1797. Under the Dutch name Isabella Baumfree, she escaped with her infant daughter in 1826. 1 year before New York's gradual emancipation law would have freed her anyway. She could not read or write, and her autobiography was dictated to a friend and published in 1850. She became one of the most powerful public speakers of the abolition movement, combining personal testimony with theological argument in a way that educated audiences found impossible to dismiss. At a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, in 1851, she delivered remarks that became among the most celebrated of the abolition era. Though historians note that the version most commonly reproduced today was reconstructed by a different writer more than a decade after the speech, and that the precise original wording is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that she stood before a contentious crowd and made an argument about the intersection of race and gender that the movement's white leadership had largely failed to articulate with the same directness and moral authority. John Brown occupied a position in the abolition movement that historians and Americans still disagree sharply about, and that disagreement is itself worth examining. Brown was a white abolitionist from Ohio who had been involved in anti-slavery activities for decades. In 1856, during the conflict over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave or free state, Brown led a group that killed 5 pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek. In October of 1859, he led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, intending to seize weapons and spark a general slave rebellion across the South. The rebellion did not materialize. Brown was captured by federal troops, tried for treason, and hanged in December of 1859. Was John Brown a terrorist or a martyr? Douglas, who knew Brown personally and admired his commitment while doubting his tactics, said after the Civil War that Brown had moved with a steel spring while others moved with a tallow candle. He meant that Brown understood the depth of violence embedded in the slave system in a way that the more comfortable abolitionists did not. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a new saint. Southern slaveholders saw in Harper's Ferry the confirmation of their darkest fears about where Northern abolitionism was leading. The argument has not settled in the century and a half since, and the honest account acknowledges that. What is historically clear is that Harper's Ferry accelerated the political crisis that produced the Civil War. The South interpreted the raid, and the expressions of sympathy for Brown in parts of the Northern press as evidence that the North could not be trusted to respect the slave system that Southern society depended on. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 on a platform opposing the extension of slavery, Southern states read it through the lens of Harper's Ferry. The abolitionist movement did not end slavery alone. It created the cultural and political conditions within which slavery could become a decisive political question. The movement was imperfect, internally divided, and frequently unable to translate moral clarity into political effectiveness. Its white members were not always willing to follow the leadership of the black men and women whose experience of slavery gave them the deepest understanding of what the movement was fighting. But it produced something essential. It produced a generation of Americans for whom slavery was no longer simply the way things were, but a moral question demanding an answer. And it produced, in Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and David Walker and Sojourner Truth and dozens of others whose names deserve more space than any single account can give them, a body of argument and example that the country has been drawing on ever since. The political crisis those arguments helped to create was building through the 1840s and 1850s with a momentum that the machinery of compromise was no longer powerful enough to contain. The wolf that Jefferson said he could neither hold nor safely release was about to break free. And what it would destroy on its way to that freedom would include the country the founders had built, the compromise they had chosen, and hundreds of thousands of lives that no one at the beginning of the road had been willing to spend to avoid it. Chapter 8. The Road to Disunion. Her name was Harriet. Most people know the name Dred Scott. Fewer know that his wife Harriet Robinson Scott had filed her own separate freedom suit in the same Missouri courts in 1846, that their cases were tried alongside each other, and that the Supreme Court decision that bears only his name was in fact a decision about two people who had sued for their freedom together and lost it together in one of the most consequential rulings in American legal history. Harriet Scott had been enslaved to an Indian agent named Lawrence Taliaferro, who had himself facilitated her marriage to Dred Scott in the 1830s. She had lived with her husband in Illinois and in the Wisconsin Territory, both of which prohibited slavery, before being returned to Missouri. She had as much legal standing as her husband to argue that her residence in free territory had made her legally free. The Supreme Court disagreed. When Chief Justice Roger Taney handed down his ruling in 1857, it was handed down over two people, one of whom history has nearly forgotten. The Dred Scott case is often taught as a single chapter in the road to the Civil War. It was also a story about a husband and wife who spent 11 years in courts trying to secure a freedom that the highest court in the land ultimately denied them. Understanding that human dimension does not change the legal history, it changes how the legal history feels. And that feeling is what this chapter is about. There is a kind of political tragedy that does not come from evil or stupidity alone. It comes from intelligent people making locally rational decisions inside a system whose overall logic is driving toward catastrophe, with each decision making the final reckoning more inevitable, while simultaneously making it feel more distant. The road to the American Civil War is this kind of tragedy. Every compromise designed to save the Union made the Union more difficult to save. Every act of political management pushed the unmanageable question one step further down the road, where it waited, growing larger. It begins with a line drawn across a map. In 1820, the United States faced its first major constitutional crisis over slavery since the founding. Missouri had applied for statehood as a slave state. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in the territories acquired through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had been left deliberately vague. Now, it could not be avoided. The crisis produced the Missouri Compromise, brokered primarily by House Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky. The compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the balance in the Senate. It also drew a geographic line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude across the remaining Louisiana Territory, prohibiting slavery north of that line and permitting it south. The compromise passed. The immediate crisis was resolved, and Thomas Jefferson, reading the news at Monticello, wrote that it was a fire bell in the night. Jefferson understood what the Missouri debate had revealed. As the nation expanded westward, the question of slavery's extension would arise again and again with increasing intensity. The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line, but lines on maps do not resolve the underlying conflict. They defer it to the next map. For a generation, the deferral held. The 1830s accumulated pressure from multiple directions. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 produced a response in Virginia that illuminates the deepening rigidity of the slave South. In the immediate aftermath, the Virginia legislature actually debated, seriously and at length, proposals for gradual emancipation. The debate was genuine. The arguments on both sides were articulated by men who understood the stakes. And then, the legislature voted against emancipation and turned instead to intensified restriction and surveillance. What happened in Virginia in 1831 and 1832 was one of the last moments when the slave South seriously considered a different path. After that debate closed, the intellectual and political culture of the slave states moved in a direction that made compromise increasingly impossible. Instead of treating slavery as a necessary evil, Southern intellectuals, politicians, and ministers began constructing an elaborate philosophical and theological defense of slavery as a positive good. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the most formidable political intellect the slave South produced, articulated this position on the Senate floor with philosophical precision. Slavery, Calhoun argued, was not a moral problem to be solved. It was the foundation of genuine Republican liberty for white citizens. He drew on Aristotle. He drew on the Bible. He constructed an argument that was internally coherent and morally catastrophic. It became the dominant intellectual framework of the slave South in the decades before the Civil War. The hardening of Southern ideology was matched by a hardening of Northern resistance. The publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, which sold 300,000 copies in its first year, introduced the human reality of slavery to a Northern audience that had previously understood it largely in the abstract. Its emotional impact was enormous. Its political effect was real. Though historians debate the precise degree of influence any single work of fiction can have on political events, the crisis accelerated through a specific mechanism: new territory. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 added an enormous swath of territory to the United States, stretching from Texas to California. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in this new territory immediately reopened the conflict the Missouri Compromise had temporarily resolved. A congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot proposed an amendment that would have prohibited slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House twice and failed in the Senate twice. In its failure, it revealed something important. The political system was no longer capable of finding compromises that both sides could accept. Henry Clay made one final attempt in 1850. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, organized the remaining Mexican territories without explicit restrictions on slavery, and included a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act requiring Northern citizens and Northern law enforcement to actively participate in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was the most consequential element of the compromise, and not in the way its architects intended. By requiring Northern participation in the machinery of slavery, it made the moral abstraction concrete for Northerners who had previously been able to disapprove from a comfortable distance. When federal marshals appeared in Boston or Cincinnati to arrest men and women who had escaped slavery and built new lives in the North, the question of slavery was no longer a Southern problem that Northern people could observe from the outside. The resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act in Northern communities was immediate and sometimes violent. The compromise that was supposed to settle the slavery question for a generation instead accelerated the radicalization of Northern opinion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 destroyed what remained of the compromise framework, proposed by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. The act repealed the Missouri Compromise line and substituted the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers of each new territory would vote on whether to permit slavery. The Missouri Compromise line, which had organized American territorial politics for 34 years, was gone. What followed in Kansas illustrated with brutal clarity why popular sovereignty was not a solution. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into the territory, each attempting to establish the population majority that would determine the outcome. Violence followed. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, and its violence was reported in newspapers across the country as evidence that the political system had lost the capacity to manage the slavery question through normal legislative processes. In the same period, a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks walked onto the floor of the United States Senate and beat Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner unconscious with a metal-tipped cane. Sumner had delivered a speech sharply criticizing pro-slavery politicians. Brooks decided the appropriate response was physical violence in the Senate chamber itself. The reaction to this event told the country something important about where it stood. In the North, Sumner became a martyr. His empty Senate seat, which he could not occupy for 3 years due to his injuries, was left vacant as a symbol of what the slave power was willing to do. In the South, Brooks was celebrated. South Carolina presented him with commemorative canes. The message from each region to the other could not have been more clearly stated. And then came Dred and Harriet Scott. Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority opinion held that Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and had no standing to bring suit in federal court. It held that Congress had no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, and it held that enslaved people were property under the Fifth Amendment, meaning the federal government was constitutionally prohibited from interfering with a slaveholder's right to take that property anywhere in the United States. The decision did not resolve the slavery crisis. It radicalized it. The Republican Party, founded in 1854 specifically to oppose the extension of slavery, had just been told by the Supreme Court that its central policy position was unconstitutional. Dred and Harriet Scott were freed by their new owner just 3 months after the Supreme Court's ruling, through a private manumission. Dred Scott died of tuberculosis 17 months later. Harriet Scott outlived him by many years and is buried near him in St. Louis. The freedom they had spent 11 years pursuing in court they received not from the legal system that denied them, but from the personal decision of a private individual. Abraham Lincoln, then a lawyer and former one-term congressman from Illinois, engaged Stephen Douglas in a series of debates during the Illinois Senate race of 1858 that crystallized the political stakes with a precision that no other public figure had yet achieved. Lincoln lost the Senate race. He won the argument. The debates were reprinted in newspapers across the country and established Lincoln as the most effective Republican voice on the slavery question. Lincoln's position was carefully calibrated. He opposed the extension of slavery to new territories. He opposed the Dred Scott decision. He supported the gradual extinction of slavery as a long-term goal. He did not, in 1858, call for immediate abolition in the states where it existed. This calibration was strategically necessary. It was also insufficient to reassure the slave South, which read Lincoln's election in November of 1860 as the beginning of the end of their way of life. They were not wrong about that. They were wrong about what the appropriate response was. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed by February of 1861. The Confederate States of America was established with Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as its president. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the new Confederacy's vice president, gave a speech in March of 1861 that the historical record preserves with uncomfortable clarity. Stephens explained, in his own words, what the Confederacy was and what it was fighting for. The foundations of the old federal government, he said, rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. That assumption was wrong. The Confederacy's foundations were laid upon what he called the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. This was what Stephens called the cornerstone of the new government. There has been significant debate in American public life about whether the Civil War was fundamentally about slavery or about states' rights or about economic differences between regions. The words of the people who actually made the decision to secede, preserved in the secession documents of the Confederate States and in speeches like Stephens's address, make their own motivation explicit. They seceded to protect slavery. They said so themselves. In writing, at the time, the road to disunion had been traveled one compromise at a time, one deferred confrontation at a time, over 4 decades. At the end of that road stood 4 years of war that would kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, with estimates in recent scholarship ranging from approximately 600,000 to higher figures, and transform the country in ways that no one at its beginning fully anticipated, including what it would mean for the people whose bondage had been at the center of the conflict throughout. A moment before we leave this chapter, Harriet Scott outlived the Supreme Court ruling that denied her freedom. She outlived her husband. She outlived the war that her case had helped to make inevitable. She died in 1876. 11 years after the 13th Amendment abolished the institution, she had spent 11 years in court trying to escape through legal argument alone. She had not needed the courts. In the end, history had moved around her, but she had stood in those courts anyway, year after year, making an argument that the system she was arguing before had already decided it would not hear. That is what eventually looks like from the inside. Chapter 9. The War and Emancipation. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The federal garrison surrendered the following day. No one died in the bombardment itself, which seemed to many observers on both sides to suggest the conflict would be short, possibly glorious, and resolved before the end of summer. They were wrong by approximately 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives. Abraham Lincoln entered the war with a single stated objective: preserve the Union. In his first inaugural address, he told Southern slaveholders explicitly that he had no intention and no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery where it existed. He was not, he said, their enemy on this question. He meant it, at least as a statement of his constitutional understanding at that moment. His private moral views on slavery were clear. He found it wrong. But his public position in the early months was that the conflict was about union, not about slavery. What changed his calculation was a combination of military necessity, political pressure, and a force that the standard account of emancipation consistently underemphasizes: the actions of enslaved people themselves. From the very beginning of the war, enslaved people along the boundaries of the conflict made decisions that forced the military and political leadership of the Union to confront the slavery question whether they wanted to or not. In May of 1861, 3 enslaved men named Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, and James Townsend escaped from Confederate labor details near Yorktown. Virginia, and presented themselves at the Union lines at Fort Monroe. The commander there, General Benjamin Butler, faced an immediate practical question. The Fugitive Slave Act was still federal law. These men were legally the property of a Confederate officer. Was Butler required to return them? Butler, a lawyer before he was a general, declared the three men contraband of war. Since the Confederacy claimed to be a foreign nation and was using enslaved labor for military purposes, he argued, the Union could seize that labor as enemy property. He would not return them. Within weeks, hundreds of enslaved people were making their way to Fort Monroe. Within months, the trickle had become a flood. Enslaved people were voting with their feet on the question of what the war was about, and their decision was transforming the military situation faster than any policy directive from Washington. Historians studying this period have documented extensively the degree to which enslaved people's self-liberation drove the political evolution of the Union's war aims. By the end of 1861, there were tens of thousands of people in Union-controlled areas who had walked away from the plantations where they had been held, presenting the Union government with a human reality that no policy of ignoring the slavery question could accommodate. Congress moved before Lincoln did. The first Confiscation Act of 1861 authorized the seizure of property used in rebellion, implicitly including enslaved people. The Second Confiscation Act of 1862 went further, declaring that enslaved people of rebel owners who came within Union lines were to be considered free. By the middle of 1862, Lincoln had concluded that emancipation was both morally right and militarily necessary. Morally right, because the war had made continued neutrality on slavery impossible to defend. Militarily necessary, because emancipation would deprive the Confederacy of the enslaved labor sustaining its war effort. Because it would make European recognition of the Confederacy politically impossible for governments that had already abolished slavery. And because it would allow the Union to recruit black soldiers whose contribution would prove essential. Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862 and shared it with his cabinet. Secretary of State William Seward gave him advice that Lincoln followed. Issue it after a Union military victory. Seward said, not in the current atmosphere of military reversal, or it will look like the last shriek on the retreat. The Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862, was the bloodiest single day in American military history, with casualties on both sides estimated by historians at approximately 23,000. It was not a clear Union victory, but it was sufficient to halt the Confederate invasion of Maryland and give Lincoln the moment Seward had described. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. It is worth being precise about what the proclamation did and did not do. The proclamation did not free all enslaved people in the United States. It explicitly exempted enslaved people in the border states that had remained in the Union, and in areas of Confederate states already under Union military control. The reasoning was the same constitutional analysis Lincoln had maintained from the beginning. He claimed authority to act under his war powers as commander-in-chief in areas of active rebellion. He did not claim authority to act against slavery in areas not in rebellion. This meant that on January 1st, 1863, the proclamation technically freed no one immediately, because the people it declared free were in Confederate-controlled territory where the Union had no power to enforce their freedom. Critics at the time and since have noted this accurately, but this criticism misses something important about its historical significance. The proclamation transformed the legal and moral character of the war in ways that could not be reversed. Every Union soldier who advanced into Confederate territory was now, legally and officially, an agent of liberation. The war had officially become what it had practically been becoming since Fort Monroe in 1861. The Confederacy's reaction confirmed the proclamation's significance. Confederate President Jefferson Davis declared it the most execrable measure in the history of guilty man. The recruitment of black soldiers that followed transformed both the military capacity of the Union and the moral meaning of the war. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. They served in segregated units under predominantly white officers, received lower pay than white soldiers until Congress equalized pay in 1864 after sustained protest, and faced the specific danger of Confederate policy that refused to recognize them as legitimate soldiers. At several documented engagements, Confederate forces executed captured black Union soldiers rather than taking them prisoner. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, whose assault on Battery Wagner in South Carolina in July of 1863 was among the most celebrated acts of courage of the entire war, was composed of free black men from the North who volunteered knowing all of this. Their choice requires a moment of consideration. These were men who enlisted in the army of a country that did not recognize them as full citizens, to fight a war that their government had initially refused to define as being about their freedom, against an enemy that had declared its intention to execute rather than imprison them. They enlisted anyway. They ran toward those guns anyway. They did it because they understood, more clearly perhaps than any white observer could, that the outcome of this war would determine whether the bell before dawn rang for another generation. They had heard that bell. Their mothers had heard it. Their grandmothers had heard it. They ran toward the guns to make it stop. As Union armies advanced through the Confederate states, the landscape was being transformed by the decisions of formerly enslaved people who were making themselves free. Plantations were abandoned as enslaved people walked away. Families separated by sale for decades searched for each other through channels that Union military presence opened. Black churches organized. Black schools were established, often by the formerly enslaved themselves, with an urgency that reflected how thoroughly they understood the relationship between literacy and freedom. In January of 1865, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, redistributing approximately 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land along the South Carolina and Georgia coast to formerly enslaved families in 40-acre plots. This is the origin of the phrase, 40 acres and a mule, which became, in the immediate post-war period, a summary of what the formerly enslaved understood they had been promised, and what they were about to be denied. Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865. 5 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December of 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States. With one exception, the amendment permitted involuntary servitude as punishment for crime. That exception, placed so carefully in the document that ended American slavery, would prove to have consequences that its framers may or may not have fully anticipated. The war was over. 4 million people were legally free. The question of what that freedom would actually mean was now the most important question in American life. The people who had run toward the guns at Battery Wagner deserved an answer worthy of what they had done. The answer they received is the story of what comes next. Chapter 10. Reconstruction and Betrayal. There is a version of American history in which Reconstruction is a dark and shameful period. A time when corrupt Northern politicians and their black allies imposed a vengeful and incompetent government on a defeated South, until honorable Southerners rose to restore order and decency. This version of events was systematically constructed in the decades after Reconstruction ended, promoted in textbooks, celebrated in films like Birth of a Nation in 1915, and taught in American schools well into the 20th century. It was a fabrication, a deliberate, sophisticated, and extraordinarily effective fabrication, but a fabrication nonetheless. The actual historical record of Reconstruction, assembled by generations of historians working from primary sources including congressional records, plantation documents, newspaper archives, and the testimonies of the people who lived through it, tells a different story entirely. Reconstruction was the most ambitious experiment in multiracial democracy that the United States had ever attempted. And it was destroyed, not by its own failures, but by a sustained campaign of terrorist violence and political betrayal that the federal government ultimately chose not to prevent. Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865 changed the political landscape before Reconstruction had properly begun. His successor, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, had remained loyal to the Union when Tennessee seceded. He had also been a slaveholder before the war and harbored a racial contempt for Black Americans that was not incidental to his politics, but central to them. Johnson moved quickly to allow Southern states to pass what became known as the Black Codes, legislation that was transparent in its purpose. The Black Codes did not restore slavery by name. They reproduced its essential conditions through legal mechanisms that stopped just short of the 13th Amendment's prohibition. Mississippi's Black Code of 1865 required formerly enslaved people to present written evidence of employment at the beginning of each year. Those without such documentation could be arrested for vagrancy and hired out to white employers, with their wages going to the county. Black Mississippians could not own firearms. They could not preach without a license from a police board. Children of parents deemed unable to support them could be apprenticed to white employers, with former enslavers given preference. These were not fringe provisions passed by a few extreme localities. They were systematic legislation passed by state governments across the South within months of the war's end. With the approval of the Johnson administration, the Republican Congress looked at what Johnson had done and concluded that the president had effectively surrendered the peace after winning the war. What Congress produced in response was a constitutional transformation of remarkable significance. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, established that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. It prohibited states from abridging the privileges of citizens, from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and from denying any person equal protection of the laws. It was the most significant addition to the constitutional framework since the Bill of Rights. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These amendments were genuine achievements, produced by a political moment that combined moral conviction, political calculation, and the unprecedented political participation of Black Americans in the democratic process. That participation was one of the most remarkable features of the Reconstruction period and one of the most thoroughly erased from the standard historical narrative for nearly a century. Black voters in the South, exercising the franchise for the first time, elected Black candidates to office at every level of government between 1868 and 1876. 16 black men served in the United States Congress, including 2 senators from Mississippi. Hiram Revels was the first. He was a free-born black minister from North Carolina who had helped organize black regiments during the Civil War and had served in the Missouri State Senate. In 1870, he was elected to fill the United States Senate seat that Jefferson Davis had vacated when he left to lead the Confederacy. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The man who sat in Jefferson Davis's seat was a black minister who had spent the war helping to destroy everything Davis had fought to protect. Blanche Bruce followed him, serving a full 6-year Senate term beginning in 1875. Born into slavery in Virginia around 1841, he had escaped during the Civil War to establish a school for freed black children in Missouri. He arrived in the Senate as the first black American to serve a full Senate term and used his position to advocate for the rights of not only black Americans, but also Native Americans and Chinese immigrants, taking positions on civil rights that made him one of the most principled voices in the chamber regardless of race. These men were not anomalies. They were part of a wave of black political participation that produced hundreds of black office holders across the South. Men who served in state legislatures, as lieutenant governors, as state treasurers, and in every other office that democratic government required to function. The governments that emerged from this political participation were not, as the lost cause narrative claimed, corrupt and incompetent administrations imposed on a helpless South. They were governments that, for the first time in Southern history, invested in public education for all children, regardless of race, built infrastructure, reformed tax systems, and attempted to create the institutions of a modern democratic society in a region that had deliberately suppressed such institutions under the slave regime. The public school systems of the Southern states were largely created during Reconstruction. Before the Civil War, education for black children was prohibited by law. The Reconstruction governments built schools, established teacher training programs, and created the institutional foundation of Southern public education that persisted, however inadequately funded and racially segregated. Through most of the 20th century, the resistance to this transformation was violent from the beginning. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, in 1865 by former Confederate officers. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate general, became one of its early national leaders and organizers. Though historians continue to examine the precise nature of his role, the Klan's purpose was the systematic suppression, through terror, of black political participation and of the white Republican politicians who supported it. The Klan and its successor organizations, the White League and the Red Shirts, conducted a sustained campaign of assassination, massacre, and intimidation across the South through the Reconstruction period that has no honest description other than domestic terrorism. The historical record of Klan violence during Reconstruction, assembled from congressional investigations, newspaper accounts, and survivor testimonies, documents murders in the thousands, beatings in the tens of thousands, and the systematic destruction of black communities, churches, and schools across the former Confederate states. Black office holders were particular targets. Black voters were warned away from polls by threats that were frequently carried out. The federal government responded with the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which gave the federal government authority to prosecute Klan violence and, in extreme circumstances, apply additional measures in areas where terrorism was overwhelming local law enforcement. President Ulysses Grant used these powers in South Carolina in 1871, deploying federal resources to arrest Klan members. The prosecutions temporarily suppressed Klan activity in those areas. Temporarily. The violence was suppressed when federal will and federal resources were applied. When those resources were withdrawn, it returned, and the withdrawal came. The political will to maintain Reconstruction eroded through the early 1870s under the pressure of multiple forces. Northern public opinion grew weary of the constant conflict and federal intervention required to sustain it. The economic depression that followed the Panic of 1873 shifted Northern political attention toward economic issues. The Supreme Court narrowed the constitutional basis for federal Reconstruction enforcement in a series of decisions that limited the reach of the 14th and 15th Amendments in ways that left Black Southerners increasingly vulnerable. The end came through a presidential election. The election of 1876, between Republican Rutherford Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden, produced a disputed result that required resolution by a specially appointed commission. The compromise that resolved the dispute, known as the Compromise of 1877, produced an outcome whose essential terms are clear from what followed. Hayes became president. Federal troops were withdrawn from the remaining southern states, where they had been protecting Reconstruction governments. Reconstruction ended. Within the following 2 decades, everything that Reconstruction had built was systematically dismantled. Black voters were removed from the rolls through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the direct violence of white supremacist organizations. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce were not replaced by other Black senators. They were replaced by white Democrats who spent the following decades actively constructing the legal architecture of racial segregation. The biracial Reconstruction governments were replaced by governments explicitly committed to the restoration of white supremacy. The public schools built during Reconstruction were maintained but starved of resources and rigidly segregated. By 1900, the political and civil gains of Reconstruction had been almost entirely reversed in the former Confederate states. The bell before dawn still rang, just under different legal arrangements. Reconstruction failed not because Black Americans were unready for freedom. It failed because the federal government of the United States made a political calculation that the cost of sustaining it was higher than the cost of abandoning it, and acted on that calculation. The people who paid the price of that calculation were not the politicians who made it. They were the formerly enslaved and their descendants who had been promised a freedom that their government chose not to protect. That choice, and its specific consequences, are what we examine next. Chapter 11. The Long Shadow. Begin with a specific mechanism, not a feeling, not a cultural legacy, not an abstraction, a specific legal and financial mechanism documented in federal records that transferred wealth along racial lines in the middle of the 20th century and whose effects are still measurable in the economic data of the 21st. In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, universally known as the GI Bill. Returning veterans from World War II would receive low-cost mortgages to buy homes, tuition assistance to attend college, and low-interest loans to start businesses. The bill created the American middle class as we recognize it today, enabling millions of working-class families to access homeownership and higher education in ways that previous generations had not. It did not do this equally. The implementation of the GI Bill was substantially controlled by local institutions, banks, real estate agencies, and university admissions offices, many of which operated in the context of legally sanctioned racial segregation Black veterans who attempted to access GI Bill benefits frequently found that local banks would not issue them mortgages for homes in the neighborhoods where those mortgages were most readily available. Real estate agents, backed by racially restrictive covenants in property deeds that courts had not yet struck down, would not show Black veterans homes in white neighborhoods. Historian Ira Katznelson, in his study of the GI Bill's racially unequal implementation, documents in detail how federal benefits that created generational wealth for white families were substantially denied to Black families, not by the text of the legislation, but by the mechanisms of its delivery. Then there was the broader housing policy. Historian Richard Rothstein, in his study of federal housing policy, The Color of Law, published in 2017, argues that the residential segregation characterizing American cities today was substantially created by deliberate federal, state, and local government policy, including the Federal Housing Administration's practice of refusing to insure mortgages in racially mixed or Black neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining. Rothstein's thesis has been influential and has generated substantive engagement from other historians who examine specific aspects of his argument. The scholarly conversation is ongoing, and honest engagement with it requires acknowledging that complexity while recognizing the documented core of his findings. Redlining meant that Black families were systematically denied access to the mortgage financing that was building white middle-class wealth through homeownership in the post-war decades. It meant that the neighborhoods where Black families were permitted to live were denied the investment that made other neighborhoods appreciate in value. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans that exists today was substantially shaped by government policy in the mid-20th century. Within living memory, this is not an argument about individual racism or collective guilt. It is a description of documented policy with documented effects that are still measurable. Then there was what came before. When Reconstruction ended and federal protection was withdrawn, the formerly enslaved and their descendants were not returned to a neutral starting position. They were returned to a society in which their former enslavers retained ownership of all the land, all the legal infrastructure, all the political power, and all the accumulated capital that the slave system had produced. The promise of redistribution had been explicitly broken. The legal system that emerged in the South in the decades after Reconstruction created new mechanisms of coerced labor that operated in the shadow of the 13th Amendment's exception for punishment of crime, vagrancy laws, contract enforcement statutes, and the convict leasing system reproduced the essential functions of the Black codes that Reconstruction legislation had struck down. Under convict leasing, individuals convicted of crimes, frequently minor offenses enforced selectively against Black Southerners, were leased to private employers, means lumber camps, agricultural operations, and railroad construction projects. Contemporary investigators and subsequent historians have documented conditions in these operations as severe, with mortality rates that some researchers have described as among the highest of any labor system in American history. Alabama abolished convict leasing in 1928. Mississippi continued it until 1940. Then there was the violence. The Tuskegee Institute recorded more than 3,400 lynchings of Black Americans between 1882 and 1950, a figure that historians believe understates the actual total because many killings were not publicly reported or documented. Lynching was a political instrument. Its targets were frequently individuals who had challenged the racial hierarchy in some way, whether by prospering economically, by asserting legal rights, or simply by refusing to behave with the deference that white supremacist social order required. Its purpose was to maintain, through the constant demonstration of available violence, the social subordination of Black Americans that formal slavery had enforced through direct legal ownership. Then there was the destruction of what had been built. In the spring of 1921, a young Black man named Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator in a Tulsa, Oklahoma, office building. An encounter with a white elevator operator led to his arrest on a charge that was almost certainly false and was eventually dropped. But before it was dropped, a newspaper story triggered a white mob that attacked Greenwood, the prosperous Black neighborhood of Tulsa known as Black Wall Street, over the course of May 31st and June 1st, 1921. White rioters burned approximately 35 blocks of Greenwood to the ground, destroying approximately 1,200 homes, as well as churches, schools, businesses, a hospital, a library, and a law office. Contemporary accounts indicate that aircraft were present over Greenwood during the attack and were used for observation, with some witness testimonies and subsequent investigations suggesting they may have been used in other capacities as well. Though historians continue to examine the precise nature of their role, the official death count at the time was 36. Subsequent research by historians and by the 1997 Oklahoma Commission suggests the actual figure may have been considerably higher. 10,000 Black Tulsans were left homeless. The property destroyed represented the accumulated wealth of a generation of Black families who had built prosperous lives through extraordinary effort. That wealth was destroyed in less than 24 hours and was never compensated. The Tulsa Massacre is the most extensively documented example of what historians have identified as a broader pattern of destruction of Black economic communities across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then there was the movement that could not be stopped. The Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 struck down the separate but equal doctrine that had justified racial segregation in public schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and employment on the basis of race. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited the discriminatory voting practices that had effectively disenfranchised Black voters across the South since the end of Reconstruction. These were historic achievements produced by one of the most disciplined and courageous mass political movements in American history, at enormous personal cost to the people who sustained it. Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar Evers, the 4 girls killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and the hundreds of others who were beaten, imprisoned, and killed for asserting rights the Constitution guaranteed them, deserve to be understood, not as passive recipients of rights bestowed by a benevolent government, but as agents who forced a reluctant government to honor commitments it had made and refused to keep. But the civil rights movement, for all its achievements, could not by itself close the economic gap that slavery and its aftermath had created. Legal equality, however essential, does not by itself transfer wealth, rebuild destroyed communities, or compensate for generations of excluded opportunity. Then there is the debate about what to do. The reparations question is the most prominent expression of that unresolved engagement, and it deserves treatment that acknowledges its genuine complexity. The case for reparations, made most comprehensively in recent years by journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates in his essay The Case for Reparations, published in The Atlantic in 2014, rests on a documented argument about the specific mechanisms through which wealth was extracted from Black Americans, not only during slavery, but through the century of discriminatory policy that followed it. Coates traces specific cases of families whose property was stolen or destroyed. whose GI Bill benefits were denied, whose neighborhoods were redlined, and argues that the documented, government-sanctioned nature of these wealth extractions creates a legitimate claim for government remedy. The case against reparations takes several forms that deserve honest engagement. Some argue that the practical difficulties of designing a workable program, determining eligibility, and calculating amounts across generations are insurmountable. Some argue that the political coalition required to pass such legislation does not exist and cannot be built, making the debate a distraction from achievable policy goals. Some argue that remedying historical injustice through transfers to present-day individuals whose personal connection to those injustices varies considerably raises genuine philosophical difficulties. Germany's payment of reparations to Holocaust survivors and to the State of Israel, and the United States government's payment of reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II, are sometimes cited as precedents. Critics note that these cases involved more direct and more recent connections between identifiable victims and identifiable perpetrators than is the case with American slavery. The debate over reparations is ultimately a debate about several questions simultaneously. What obligations does a democratic government have to remedy the consequences of its own documented past policies? Who counts as a victim and who counts as a beneficiary? And what mechanisms are available and appropriate for discharging those obligations in a politically functional society? These are not questions with obvious answers. Intelligent and morally serious people reach different conclusions. What is not honest is pretending that the wealth gap between Black and white Americans today has no connection to the specific historical policies documented in this chapter. The connection is not a matter of opinion. It is where the documented record leads. Then, there are the ongoing disparities that remain contested in their interpretation. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander's argument in her book, The New Jim Crow, published in 2010, that mass incarceration functions as a system of racialized social control, has been enormously influential and has also generated serious scholarly criticism and counterargument from researchers who share her concerns about racial disparities but question specific aspects of her framework. The underlying facts about racial disparities in the American criminal justice system are not seriously disputed. Black Americans are incarcerated at rates significantly higher than white Americans, are more likely to be stopped and arrested for equivalent behavior, and receive on average longer sentences for equivalent offenses. Whether these disparities are best explained primarily by systemic racial bias in the criminal justice system, by socioeconomic factors that are themselves the product of historical racial discrimination, or by some combination of these and other factors, is a question that researchers continue to examine, and that honest engagement with the evidence requires treating as genuinely complex. The bell rang before dawn for 250 years. The legal architecture that required it was dismantled. The economic consequences of 250 years of that bell were not dismantled with it. The mechanisms we have traced in this chapter are the specific ways in which those consequences were carried forward, not through vague cultural transmission, through specific policies, specific laws, and specific decisions made by identifiable people at identifiable moments. Understanding that is not the end of the argument. It is where an honest one has to begin. Chapter 12. The Argument That Will Not End. There is a phrase that appears in American political discourse whenever the history examined in this documentary becomes the subject of public debate. The phrase is, "We need to move forward." It is said with genuine sincerity by people who are not wrong that societies cannot function if they are permanently paralyzed by historical grievance. It is also said, sometimes, as a way of avoiding a specific and uncomfortable question. What does moving forward actually require when the road behind you is the road that built the road ahead? This documentary has tried to trace that road honestly. It began with a woman whose name we do not know, taken from a life she had built, loaded onto a ship, crossing an ocean she had not chosen, arriving in a world that would classify her as property, and we followed the road she helped to build, through the legal architecture that organized her bondage, through the economic system that extracted her labor, through the lives of the millions who came after her inside the same machine, through the founders who understood the contradiction their republic was built on and chose to defer it, through the abolitionists who refused to let that deferral stand, through the war that ended the legal institution and the Reconstruction that was supposed to begin something new and was instead destroyed by terror and political calculation. And we trace the long chain of specific mechanisms through which the consequences of that institution were carried forward into the century and a half that followed. Now, standing at the end of that road, the question the documentary began with demands an answer. How does a country founded on freedom spend 250 years building its wealth on the destruction of that same freedom? The honest answer is that it does so the same way human beings do most things that they will later find difficult to justify. Not through cartoonish villainy, not through a single catastrophic choice, but through a series of decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, each of which seemed locally defensible and collectively produced something that no single decision maker fully intended or fully saw. The Virginia planter who chose racial chattel slavery over the multiracial labor solidarity that frightened him after Bacon's rebellion was protecting his property by the logic available to him in 1676. The constitutional delegate who agreed to the 3/5 compromise was preserving the Union by the logic available to him in 1787. The Northern merchant who financed a cotton plantation while finding slavery morally troubling, was participating in the market available to him in 1830. The politician who ended Reconstruction to resolve an election dispute was managing the political pressures available to him in 1877. The federal administrator who approved a redlining map in 1938 was following the institutional guidelines available to him in his time and place. Each of these decisions was made by a person in a context. Each of them contributed to a chain of consequences that extended far beyond what that person could see from where they stood. That is how institutions work. That is how history works. And that is why understanding history at the level of systems and structures, not just at the level of individual virtue and individual vice, is the only way to understand how the present was built. The reason the argument over American slavery will not end is not that Americans are uniquely quarrelsome or uniquely divided. It is that the questions the history raises are genuinely difficult and genuinely important, and they have not been resolved by time alone. What obligations does a democratic government bear toward people harmed by the documented policies of previous governments? Is the wealth gap measurable in present-day economic data a historical artifact that will eventually close on its own? Or a structural feature that requires structural intervention? What does honest national history look like? And how does a society acknowledge the past without turning that acknowledgement into a weapon or a shield? These questions do not have answers that everyone will find satisfying. They may not have answers that everyone will ever agree on, but they have a history, and the history is knowable. And knowing it honestly is a different thing from the simplified versions that serve political purposes on every side of the debate. Other societies that have faced analogous questions offer some perspective. Germany's deliberate institutionalization of Holocaust memory through education, memorials, and reparations represents one model of national reckoning. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission represents another, one that prioritized public testimony and acknowledgement over punishment, with genuine achievements and genuine limitations. Neither model translates directly to the American situation, but both demonstrate something important. A society can choose, through deliberate institutional action, to maintain an honest relationship with its own history rather than allowing comfortable forgetting to fill the space that honest accounting would occupy. The United States has not made that choice with the same consistency or institutional commitment. What it has produced instead is an ongoing argument that proceeds simultaneously in courtrooms, classrooms, legislative chambers, and the internal lives of individual Americans trying to figure out what the history means for how they should live and what they should demand of their government. This documentary has tried to do something specific within that argument. It has tried to look at specific people making specific decisions with specific consequences. It has tried to distinguish between what is documented and what is debated, between what is known with confidence and what is genuinely uncertain. It has tried to take seriously the humanity of everyone inside the story, including the people who built and sustained and defended the slave system, not to excuse them, but to understand the decisions that produced outcomes no single decision maker fully intended. And it has tried to hold two things simultaneously that the political culture of the present often insists on separating. The first is that the history of American slavery and the specific policies through which its effects were extended across a century and a half after emancipation is documented and knowable and relevant to understanding the present. The wealth gap is not a mystery. The mechanisms that produced it are not hidden. They are in the archives, in the federal agency records, in the plantation account books, in the congressional testimony, in the court records, in the testimonies of the people who lived through all of it. Knowing that history is not a political act, it is an act of intellectual honesty. The second is that knowing that history does not by itself tell you what to do about it. Reasonable and morally serious people look at the same documented facts and reach different conclusions about what remedies are available, what mechanisms are appropriate, and what obligations the present generation bears toward a past it did not create. Those disagreements deserve to be engaged honestly, rather than dismissed as evidence of bad faith. We began with a number and a name that did not survive. Roughly 12.5 million people loaded onto ships. 2 million who did not survive the crossing. A woman taken from a life she had built, whose name the historical record did not keep, whose crossing made possible everything that came after. She is not in any archive. She left no testimony. The ship that carried her recorded her as cargo. The society that received her recorded her as property. And the country that was built on the labor of people like her spent 2.5 centuries arguing about whether that labor entitled the people who performed it to anything at all. She crossed an ocean. She helped build a nation. She was given nothing for it. And the argument over what was owed has never truly ended. The bell rang before dawn for her. It rang for her children. It rang for their children, for generations upon generations of people who woke before the sun because a system had decided their bodies were capital and their time was not their own. The legal institution that required that bell was abolished in 1865. The economic and social structures built around it were not abolished with it. They were adapted and extended and carried forward through the specific mechanisms this documentary has traced. And they are present in measurable and documented ways in the country that exists today. That is not meant as a verdict. It is where the documented record leads. And facts are where honest argument has to begin. The argument over American slavery will not end because it is, at its core, an argument about what America is and what America owes and what America intends to become. It is the oldest unresolved argument the country has. It was present at the founding. It drove the bloodiest war in American history. It shaped the century that followed that war. And it is present in every conversation about the present, for anyone who knows enough of the history to see it. The woman whose name we do not know crossed an ocean to build something she would never be allowed to own. What this country does with what she built is still being decided by everyone who chooses to look at it honestly, by everyone who chooses not to look away,